Welcome, everyone. My name's Wendy Fenton, and I'm the coordinator of the Humanitarian Practice Network and a senior research fellow at ODI. And I'll be moderating today's session on humanitarian AI, the hype, the hope, and the future. Artificial intelligence and machine learning advocates often stress that the effective application of these systems could improve humanitarian action by doing less with more and ultimately saving more lives. AI and machine learning offer a range of benefits to early warning and humanitarian preparedness, to assessments and monitoring, on service delivery and support, and operational and organizational efficiency. But while an increasing number of humanitarian agencies have demonstrated that it's possible to use AI and machine learning in humanitarian contexts, I think few have demonstrated why we should use these tools above others. And nor have they adequately interrogated and addressed the risks associated with them. So today our panelists will discuss the opportunities and the risks related to humanitarian AI and machine learning, as well as the barriers to scale. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists. So first of all, we have Sarah Spencer, who's an expert in humanitarian aid, development, and foreign policy with more than 20 years of experience. Sarah's a regular commentator and contributor on AI and machine learning and technology for good, and has advised government and civil society on the threats and opportunities posed by emerging technologies. She currently works as an independent consultant and is on sabbatical from the British government. And Sarah is going to present the findings from a new Humanitarian Practice Network paper with the same title as this session, Humanitarian AI, the Hype, the Hope, and the Future. And you can find a link to that in the chat. Next, we have Cameron Burge, who manages Microsoft Philanthropy's corporate response to sudden onset humanitarian disasters around the world. And he also manages the AI for Humanitarian Action program and provides guidance to nonprofits on applying technology in the humanitarian space. Before joining Microsoft in 2016, Cameron worked with the UN World Food Program for 10 years, primarily in South Sudan. And prior to that, he was with the US Army for 5 years in Iraq and Korea. Cameron's going to discuss lessons learned from Microsoft's work on AI for humanitarian action. And then last but not least, we have Pierre De Vidal, who has been a policy analyst and advisor with the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva for the past 7 years. And an international lawyer by training, his focus is on counterterrorism, non-state armed groups, and the impact of digital technologies on humanitarian action. Prior to joining the ICRC, Pierre worked as a protection officer for asylum seekers in France, as a humanitarian field worker in Darfur, and was a human rights and criminal investigator with different international organizations in Africa and the Middle East. And Pierre will share thoughts on the opportunities and challenges that AI and machine learning bring for humanitarian action. So welcome to all of our panelists. Now, before I hand over to Sarah, please note that this session is being recorded. You can submit your questions and comments via the chat box, and we'll try to address as many of these as we can following the presentations. We're hoping to run this more as a curated conversation rather than a straight Q&A. So without further ado, Sarah, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Wendy, and thank you so much to you and to the organizers of this conference and this particular panel. I think it's a really great opportunity for us to dig in to some of the critical challenges that exist around applying artificial intelligence and machine learning to the humanitarian space, both in the delivery of humanitarian response and humanitarian action, as well as humanitarian policy and IHL. I'm not going to speak at great length, but I did want to just highlight a couple of things that emerged from the paper that I've just written for the Humanitarian Practice Network, as you mentioned. There are a lot of really interesting emerging use cases and opportunities related to artificial intelligence and humanitarian action. Some of these are being tested and sort of results are being posted and shared across the industry, which is great. And there's a couple of other risks and opportunities. I think, generally speaking, I would say that I feel like the risks and the setbacks get a lot of airtime, but don't necessarily get broken down into really concrete threats and concrete risks related to AI. So I wanted to take a bit of time to just really explore some of those, which the paper explores in a bit more detail. So these systems do have the potential to change humanitarian action, but one of the challenges so far is the business ecosystem and the market related to AI and machine learning remains selectively transparent, or selectively transparent, slightly opaque. So humanitarian actors, as many will agree, are slightly competitive in the way in which they develop interventions. And I suppose the way in which they communicate successes and equally failures is limited. So I don't know that there's enough transparency around how AI is being used across the humanitarian industry, how the successes and the failures of those use cases are being communicated out, but equally how the tech industry is sharing what they're doing across their networks and industries, because equally the tech industry is fairly competitive. So I don't know that there's necessarily enough transparency and light being shed on what is working and what actually hasn't worked, and for what reasons why. There are some issues related to data. The quality of data is mixed, and in some cases actually extremely poor. A number of operational aid agencies reported still, keeping data on laptops using paper, pencil. Data isn't necessarily consistently collected and classified and managed in the same ways across the whole of a country program, let alone the whole of an agency, let alone across the entire industry. So that is a challenge. There are challenges related to data protection and consent. Many of us will be familiar with the allegations that Human Rights Watch exposed earlier in this year related to data being collected in Bangladesh with regards to Rohingya populations displaced from Myanmar. But I think there's a whole host of questions being raised around seeking and securing consent from individuals to use their data in advanced technologies and in new technologies. I'm not sure that we have great examples of how to do that yet. And then finally, potentially most critically, is trying to identify the specific problem we are trying to solve. Oftentimes, and especially in the research that I was doing for this paper, I would turn up use cases where people were designing really interesting use cases around a particular technological capability, rather than thinking about the whole sort of spectrum of service delivery, for example, or the most critical pressing challenges that humanitarian actors face when delivering humanitarian services and support in X country, and then looking at the range of tools that you can leverage to deliver impact or greater impact at that problem set. And I think, related to that is trying to understand the role of, for example, something like predictive analytics, which is really helpful in shedding potential new insights, greater analysis on a particular problem set. But oftentimes, I would argue, in some cases, the issue is not a data problem or an analysis problem. The issue is a political one, and we need to really unpick what problems that we are trying to solve. The other thing I wanted to comment on, which wasn't necessarily a significant feature of the paper as such, but has certainly increasingly factoring into humanitarian debates and discussions, particularly in the United Kingdom at the moment, is really about how new technologies are going to change the operating environments that we as humanitarians are used to. So we are in the middle of a cyber arms race, arguably. There is rising geopolitical competition and threats related to a new Cold War, an AI Cold War. All of these things are coming together to change the nature of armed conflict and warfare and how humanitarian actors will respond and are called on to respond. And I think probably Pierre might have some things to say about that in terms of ICRC's thinking, not to put too much pressure on you, Pierre, but I think really this behooves humanitarian actors to think about what it means what does the future of warfare look like? How will these new technologies play a role in changing conflict dynamics? How humanitarian actors are perceived, how easy it will be to manipulate the actions or the perceived actions and responses of humanitarian actors, and how easy it will be to manipulate populations at large into believing one thing or another, or in preventing their access to humanitarian access, action, safe access to a border, etc. And I think that feels very far away into the future, but I fear it's closer than we think. And there's not yet enough discussion and debate happening in that space to feel like we're really starting to crack the nut and adapt our bureaucracies to effectively start unpicking some of those problems. So I'll stop there with those 2 big points and pass back to you, Wendy.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Yeah, some interesting challenges there, and there's much more in the paper as well. So I really urge you to read that. I'm going to move to Cameron now in the interest of time, and we'll pick up on some of those points that Sarah raised later in the discussion. Cameron, over to you.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you everybody for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. As Wendy mentioned, I work for Microsoft and our philanthropies team, managing a number of different programs, and one of which is the AI for Humanitarian Action program. For those not familiar, it is one of our overall AI for Good portfolio, which includes programs such as AI for Earth, AI for mental health, and AI for cultural heritage. On our side, it's on humanitarian action, which is focused on 4 pillars, which is disaster response, needs of refugees and displaced persons, human rights, and the needs of women and children. Apologies, I'm coming back after a long leave, so I am still getting all freshed up, all caught up. Our program is structured so that we provide resources to organizations that are attempting to address a challenge under one of those 4 pillars. And they could be a nonprofit, they can be a private sector organization, they can be academia. And we actually, in the last open call, even opened up for working with private sector partners and provide that assistance. And Sarah pointed out that there's a number of challenges in this space, which I'll get into. But what we've attempted to do is what we try to do is bring the resources that clearly and safely and responsibly apply this technology to a problem. And so what do we mean by that? When we work with an organization, we want to see, is the problem appropriate and clear? A lot of the stuff where this technology applies is going to be kind of in the boring space. I have to admit, it's going to be in areas of, hey, look, we do a lot of rote work that's taking up so many of our man hours time. How can we use technology, and is AI appropriate in this space? That's critical that we work with organizations on. As Sarah mentioned, they have to have the data. It's got to be clean. Now, we do work with folks to assist in this, but it is a big one. And also understanding what we mean by having data. We did have an organization that came to us with 50 rows of Excel, which was a very nice sheet, but it's not enough for the type of technology that we're talking about. And so understanding that. And then we really want to see organizations design the program correctly. And what do I mean by that? This is not black box technology. This is not fairy dust that's being applied here. So what we want to see is organizations have an existing process, saying, we as an organization, we address this humanitarian challenge, and this is how we do it. We've identified we have this challenge here where we believe technology can be applied appropriately. And owning that process, and then understanding that there's a human in the loop at all times. And so when we develop models, when we develop solutions, that needs to be owned, because at some point they will break, at some point they need maintenance, and all that has to happen. And is that part of the process? And so we want to see this when the projects are being designed. And then finally, and I mentioned earlier, when we're looking at the design, the boring stuff really works well. What we're talking about is when you know you are when humanitarian organizations who are short on manpower have to take people and apply them to hours and hours and hours of stuff they know they wish they could apply them better at elsewhere, that might be a good spot to start looking at where this technology applies. Some quick examples here, and being cognizant of the time, realizing I have more notes than time. I just figured that out. We've had some great successes recently. Turkish Red Crescent, they are responsible for the refugee support within the country of Turkey from the Syrian crisis. Their business problem was family unification with family members in Europe. They had a manual-based system that was very slow. So we did 2 things. One, first off, just digitize it. I mean, that was step 1, get them on a digital platform. And step two, they wanted to use facial recognition to help with the use of photographs to identify family members. Well, facial recognition is extraordinarily sensitive. So the way that it was approached was multi-step. Our data science team, first off, took an open source facial recognition model, one that's non-proprietary, the organization could have, modify, do whatever they want with. And the second, to ensure there's no bias in it, is we trained the model actually in all the volunteers from the Turkish Red Crescent. So we got the geographical areas and it was trained for the area. And then the most important thing, and one that our internal ethics review committee gave us guidance on, is ensuring that the model is actually not accessible to the refugees. It's for the caseworker. And the model is a step in the validation process for reunifying families. And so consent-based photos are submitted on both sides. The caseworker uses it as a piece of evidence to help see if a family should be reunified, but it's not a standalone. There are other factors that have to be brought in, and then the caseworker makes a decision on the steps forward based on their existing processes. And that's why we felt the technology is appropriate and would be well used there. And then on the road stuff, we do a variety of things. We bring in both our data science team, we bring in partners for data engineering, but sometimes we just give over Azure grants to organizations which have internal capacity. A great one right now, India Institute of Technology. Business problem they were helping the local health ministry with is that vaccine cards in India, beautifully structured, which we loved. They're fantastic. You can see where the different vaccines are in columns, but it's all paper-based. And so when people are trying to document the vaccines, either for a medical record or to see what's taking place, that's all manual entry. So they just wanted to use a quick optical character recognition model to locally train to actually automatically start capturing all those details. Not only has that worked, that's rolled out in 2 districts, they were actually able to also increase the capacity to gather additional information off the card. So now, again, this manual process, which is taking hours and hours and hours, starts happening instantaneously. And we like these. We like clear projects that are owned. These aren't pilots. We like these problems should be solvable. We can push the boundaries of technology on our investments. That's what we look to do with our data science teams. If off-the-shelf AI technology is already available, that's what we recommend. We do help push the boundaries and bring those resources to help. But again, we want to see the organization have the capacity to then carry it forward. And then where it doesn't work, we mentioned not enough data, not clean. The big thing, I think, where we have a lot of conversations, and for those who are Isaac Asimov Foundation fans, is this area of psychohistory, which in that genre of science fiction is this ability to predict how humans are going to act in some near and far-term future. We get a lot of those requests. It is not appropriate use of the technology. While there are some predictive elements that can be, especially areas around classifications, that's where humans are good at, and that's where humans should stay good at. And a good example here on the bringing the balance in is our Carter Center project. Carter Center does a lot of analysis on the Syrian conflict. They had a data pipeline of different articles and stories that their workers were manually, classifying. But then after you take those classifications, and then you have to do the so what analysis. What does all this mean? How does this impact the area? So we helped automate that first part, so all the people can get freed up and do the so what part, because that so what part is not where the technology is going to be good at, and is just going to lead people astray. And then the future, where do we think this is headed? What's being successful? One, imagery analysis. Absolutely, it is fertile territory. We're running some successful projects. We have 2 that are around building damage classification from satellite imagery. We just did that recently with the Netherlands Red Cross Unit 510. They have a model which is now open source that anybody can use. Those are really appropriate. Casework at scale, especially in a lot of great work happening in this and really advanced chatbots. And I say this one too, because that's also what's happening internally in our sector. Within Microsoft, within the tech industry, we have these automated systems that are now doing a lot of the basic steps just on its own. And then when you get to a certain level, you get bumped up to human support. We can see that for casework. And then also the use of technologies to help secure and anonymize a lot of the data from information sharing. Sarah mentioned this. Yes, everybody does work in a lot of times their own bubble, and there's competitive reasons for that. But at the same time, we are trying to encourage folks to share information. The more data you have, the more impactful this can be. And there's a lot of tools that are now coming out to help with that, which protect the sensitivity of the data the organization has, but still provides enough to partners so that you can start doing analysis at scale. With that, Wendy, I'll go ahead and stop there and hand back to you, and then we can go through questions that come up after.
That's great, Cameron. Thanks very much. Really interesting. I'm going to move straight on to Pierre now, and I see some questions coming through on the chat, which we'll get to later. Pierre, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So I hope you can hear me well. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. It's a super interesting, but also necessary conversation, and I'm really glad we're having it. And so thank you for the opportunity to be here. Okay, I'm going to take a few step backs from Sarah's and Cameron, basically. And what I want to do is share, in the time that I have, is share with you some of the questions I ask myself when I have to provide policy advice on artificial intelligence to my colleagues at the ICRC, basically. And also share some of the dilemmas that come up when you're trying to make humanitarian sense of AI, basically. So what I will do is first make some remarks about AI and the humanitarian sector, and then look at how AI relates to the fundamental principles of humanitarian action, because I think these are two good prisms to think about the issue, basically. So first, we've seen, while the conversation is actually often about whether AI is fit for humanitarian purposes, but I think what we also probably also need to look into is the other way around. So basically, is the humanitarian sector fit for AI purposes? That's also a way that is interesting to look at it, I think. And in terms of readiness for AI, on one end, there's obviously a lot of appetite from humanitarian organizations. We're always looking for new solutions to humanitarian problems. There's also a lot of appetite from donors, from partners, who all see opportunities for partnership, for alignment with the strategic objective, and so on and so forth. So a lot of appetite. On the other hand, it's probably fair to say that at this stage, humanitarian people, humanitarian data, systems, and infrastructure are probably not yet fully ready and fit for AI purposes. So Sarah has mentioned some of it, but I will come back to that. For me, the first one is basically many humanitarians are still lacking digital and data literacy. And they are not really necessarily always equipped to understand and interact with AI systems and tools, and in particular on the ground. But that's also true. So that's true for frontline responders, but I would say that's also true for humanitarian leaders and decision makers. They also do not always understand the stakes at play around AI. And it's, AI for them is always just, oh yeah, another computer thing, It's slightly more complicated than that, and they don't always get it. So I think the first step for me is we need to educate ourselves as a sector. And I think that's very important to acknowledge as a first step. So that's where I would put the first challenge, basically. Then I think it's also fair to say, Sarah's mentioned it, and Cameron also alluded to it, humanitarian data required to feed machine learning for the moment is a bit all over the place. It's insufficiently protected, it's unstructured, it's incomplete, and not very reliable, basically. I think what we have to move away from is the big data myth. Like 5 years ago, everybody was running for big data. So basically we all collected as much data as possible. And now we realize, okay, we have a problem with it. We need to get better at small data. We need to get better at data minimization and data hygiene and data protection principles. The thing is, we already have all the policies in place. What is lacking, I think, is to translate them now into action and to have the ability to make them a reality. So that's where we still have to work. And so that's why for now, I would say humanitarian data is probably more of a challenge than an asset for artificial intelligence. Another problem that we have is, like everyone else, humanitarians are completely mesmerized by AI. We find it, wow, it's so cool, it looks fantastic. We have a serious fascination bias for it, I think. It's natural for us, it's a functional bias. We have a functional bias for techno-solutionism. Why? Because we have plenty of very hard problems to crack. And we genuinely hope that actually tech solution can help us. Sometimes though, that hope actually makes us a little bit naive, and I think we need to be aware of that. The fascination effect, of course, bias rather, is reinforced by two things, the bandwagon effect and the group thinking, because the entire world, including the humanitarian sector, seem to have jumped already on the AI train. We're not sure where the train is going, but we are on it already. So I think there's a strong fear of missing out from humanitarian, and we need to realize that this is putting pressure on ourselves, basically. In reaction, this has triggered a negative reaction of techno-skepticism, basically, within the sector. And so now we kind of divided between those who think that AI will save the world and those who think that AI will destroy it. Now that is really not helpful. We need to move away from this binary approach to AI. We need to have a more sophisticated understanding of the rapport to AI. And I think that's why Sarah's report is particularly helpful for that. And that's exactly where we need to go and need to be. And then on the sector, I think finally, maybe we have to realize that we're going through a relatively dynamic period. There's increased competition and politicization of humanitarian action. There's growing convergence between humanitarian agendas, development agenda, security agenda, climate agenda, and all of this. And I think there's also, we are going through some introspection, the past of the sector and the future of the sector. So basically, in that context, I think AI represents an additional factor of disruption for humanitarian actors. And that's how we should take it. We should consider it as such. Because if we don't consider it as such, then what we're going to do, we're just going to go fast and break things, if that reminds you something about the past. And I think there's also, the risk, the feeling that AI could turn into a cancer. Why? Because it will spread and we will not control it. It has a somehow inside like kind of a metastatic nature. And I think we need to really mitigate that risk, because for the humanitarian sector, it could become a problem. So now I will move to using basically the fundamental humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, independence, and neutrality as an analytical framework to think a little bit about the relationship between AI and humanitarian action. So in terms of humanity and preventing human suffering, basically, that's what the humanity principle is about. I think AI provides a unique opportunity to advance prevention. I mean, Sarah mentioned it. It will enable the identification of humanitarian problems, patterns, and dynamics that so far we haven't seen. That's really good. And this example of predictive AI and how it can help improve our understanding of when or why people decide to move in a conflict, for instance, I think it's very important. But I'm also a little bit suspicious and concerned, because when I see, so in particular on predictive AI, because for instance, conflict-related displacement analysis, they're not used to trigger humanitarian responses. Most of the time they're used to trigger security responses. You see border that are closing and walls that are being built. So we need to be careful about that. In terms of impartiality now, I think we know that AI brings a systemic bias problem because it relies on historical data sets that exclude or misrepresent race, gender, and minority. That's a problem for us. The fact that even today, the most powerful AI systems are still not able to correctly identify non-white and female faces raises this question on how well they would do in conflict-affected countries. Because guess what? Over there are a lot of non-white and non-male people. So we need to deal with that. On the other hand, we know that also the strength of AI is that it's not constrained by human biases or human considerations. So it has the potential to identify new or hidden forms of vulnerabilities. And I think that's a plus that we should definitely explore, because that would be good for us. So it's both a risk and a challenge for impartiality. Then for me, one of the key questions around is that AI brings is a tension around the principle of neutrality. To gain trust and access and be secure, we need to not engage and not take sides with the conflict to the parties, and we cannot engage in controversies of political nature because that always fire back at us. So I think it's always good to remember that technologies, including AI, are not neutral. They are a manifestation of the political and socioeconomic ideologies of those who invent, design, finance, and deploy them. It's also clear that there's a growing politicization, I mean, Sarah mentioned it, of the conversation around AI. I think that is not good news for humanitarians, because the great power competition is fueling a race for AI and a war on data. There's the rise of digital sovereignty, splinter nets, sovereign cloud, and all this stuff. And I think it's threatening to fragment the global digital ecosystem, basically. And again, that's not good for us, because we will have to manage this and what it means for us. I think we as humanitarian and the humanitarian sector is also a strategic target for commercial actors and AI developers and merchants. Most of humanitarian action actually occurs in new markets where there's little regulation, a lot of potential for new users and new products and all of R&D and things like that. And also, let's be clear and honest, the humanitarian sector is mostly financed by the West for now, and they are in competition with China. So basically, investing in the humanitarian sectors to develop AI is a good way for them to compete. So rightly or wrongly, I think AI has become a key strategic asset for states, and it's leading to a trend of techno-nationalism. So for us, that brings the question of okay, so in this polarized environment, how do you stay neutral in your choice and use of AI? What is a neutral AI? We don't know. Is it the Chinese one, the American one? We just don't know yet. Yet we have to ask ourselves this question. If you partner with a company that's also partnering with the Ministry of Defense back home, are you still neutral? So all of these questions are up in the air. I think we need to consider them. And so the final principle, I'm slightly over time, but I will be done within the minute, I promise, is the question of independence for humanitarian actors and their ability to maintain operational autonomy, basically. AI systems, they add another layer of dependency for humanitarian organization, I think. If we use commercial solutions, well, by definition, we're going to reduce our autonomy and the risk that we will be dependent on those commercial solutions is there. Once you have invested in a specific AI systems with the tool, processes, knowledge, and all that alone, it's actually a little bit, you have a strong incentive to stay within that ecosystem, I think, and that reduces your dependency. The switching cost, the vendor lock-in system, and all these risks are real for humanitarian actors. We need to think about them. But that brings an opportunity, maybe, and Cameron mentioned it, building open source AI systems that leverage local expertise, local knowledge, and infrastructure, and offer potential for local development and reduce dependencies. I think these are great opportunities that we need to continue to explore. And I will stop here for now and happy to take questions, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Fascinating. No, I found all three presentations really interesting and lots of food for thought. I mean, before I go to the chat, where I know we have a few questions, Pierre, I just want on that last point that you made about, once we go to the private sector, then we're sort of locked in, we're in danger of being locked into that sort of provider or that service or that environment. Don't we do that anyway in lots of the, with procurement relationships, with partnership arrangements with others, not just private sector? Why is this particularly dangerous, I suppose, for humanitarians?
Yeah, excellent question, Wendy. And just to remind, like the principle of independence, or actually the fundamental principles, they are not an end per se. It's not our objective. It's the toolbox we use. So it is something we always aim at. And I think vis-a-vis independence, we are not independent. What we are trying to do is to best manage the many dependencies we have. So, and that's how we should frame the question. And so basically here, the question is, okay, you are just adding yet another layer. And that layer is significant because, again, as we said, it's going to spread. There's no, there's also the ratchet effect with AI systems. Once you get there, you don't go back. That's not true. It's not happening. So basically, that level of dependency, that additional layer that we have, it's big. We don't know actually how far it reach and how far it will reach. That's why we need to be careful about it. So it's not different than the other questions of dependencies that we have, but it is different because of the magnitude of the scale, basically, that it will have on our ability to act and operate autonomously.
Okay, interesting. Cameron, do you have any thoughts on that? You look like you might want to comment.
Yeah, I actually really wanted to jump on some of the work that Pierre said. And for those out there, I would like you to really, what Pierre does is extraordinarily important, which means if you are having a conversation with your organization, you're looking to use AI, particularly in a sensitive space, you need to pull in your policy and your legal folks immediately, not after you've already talked to folks like me. You've got to have that in the design. Now, obviously, if you were looking for AI solution to, again, OCR technology or something simple, then no, that's not sensitive. Within Microsoft, we have an ethics committee that we have to apply to. And a number of our projects, I need to submit and get approvals and have this discussion because you need that guidance. This cannot be standalone. And we are very cognizant of the concerns of tech lock-in. So in our investments, everything is owned by the organization. If we do a custom model, it's yours. We would prefer you to open source it afterwards, let others use it, but it's not a requirement. But that has to be part of the discussion. What is the future of what you're building, and how do you separate the process from the vendor of the technology? I mean, we absolutely, obviously love it when people use Microsoft. It's great, but there shouldn't be a dependency there. It should be because it's a choice. And we also look to make investments in that space and work in that space as well. So I just wanted to jump in with that because he brought some great stuff, and I really want people to take away with that when they're having these discussions.
Can I come in, Wendy, really
Sarah.
quickly? I was going to come in and talk about a little bit about some of the relationships, and Pierre and Cameron are absolutely right that there is a need for us to sort of better integrate all of the systems and people that we have within an agency before embarking on sort of external relationships with tech firms. I guess there's a couple points of reflection or lessons learned. One, I think a lot of humanitarian agencies think of new technologies as this separate thing that's separate to the work they're doing. So they're like, I'm going to get on with my GPV program. I'm going to get on with my water and sanitation program. New tech sits with Pierre, and it's like off in this place here. It doesn't affect me. That's a little bit to being like, that's the electricity department. And now I'm going to go down and look at this stuff. I mean, I'm a techno-pragmatist. I do think it's going to change the way in which we organize our societies in ways that we haven't yet really understood. So that's my that's the caveat for that statement. But I do think we're missing a trick by keeping that segmented and far away from the people who own the problems in humanitarian action. So the technical units, right? The education people, the child protection people, the family tracing and reunification, whatever those units are, those ones are the ones where we need to have a significant upskill in digital literacy. And where I'm talking from, data and understanding data, but also understanding the potential impact of these tools, because that is really where you'll start to find these really interesting use cases. So one of the cases I came across was around how predictive modeling and machine learning was being used to track and predict where cholera would break out within a 1 square kilometer basis, and therefore deploy in advance hand washing, vaccine campaigns, public awareness campaigns to basically try and constrict the spread of cholera in places in Yemen. Now, I think that's actually quite clever. And I think that the cost of getting it wrong, it's low stakes. It doesn't matter if you've done hand washing in a place that ultimately doesn't end up needing hand washing. Great, people have cleaner hands. So it's not as if there's like these really high stake measures. They've done it really carefully. They've thought about it really carefully. But a lot of that was because of people who are the health program people, the public health program people were really involved in that design. And I think that's how we need to invert it. In some of the interviews I have for this paper, a lot of people reflected back saying, and I think this is true from both the people who own the technologies, like Cameron and his team and others, as well as from the sort of humanitarians. On the humanitarian side, there is this gatekeeping syndrome where anything to do with new technologies either sits with the CTO or sits with the sort of innovation teams, and everyone is doing all this like cool, sexy new work and separate from the programs. And the technologists will say, well, we really want to go and talk to the WhatsApp people. We really do want to go and have these like collaborative discussions and like flesh out some of the issues that Pierre flags up. But those relationships are either being held at a higher strategic level within a corporation to say, these are strategic relationships for us to manage our relationship with Microsoft or our relationship with Facebook or our relationships with Cisco. And so therefore it never filters down to sort of the operational level, which is where the sort of pointy end of the problem set is really. And I think it comes back to, Karen was talking about boring issues, and I agree with a boring space. One of the more boring things is how our bureaucracies constrain us. And the bureaucracies related to humanitarian action right now are constraining us in trying to think through the impact of these new technologies in the operating environments that we work in and the impact on how we can use them for better humanitarian action.
Really, really good point, Sarah. And I know you talk about those in your paper. Have you got any ideas about how those can be overcome? What do agencies need to do? The other question I have too, and sorry for those who've put their questions in the chat. I promise we'll get to those as well. I've just got too many questions of my own to ask first. But what about local actors? Because it's bad enough within some of the big, already fairly tech savvy in relative terms, agencies that are working in some of these areas and actually developing products, I understand, of their own. How much they share those or collaborate with other agencies in the humanitarian sector is a question. Are we all off beavering away on our own projects here, or is there a lot of work that's going on between agencies with support from or in collaboration with the private sector, number one? And the second one is, what about local actors? Are they going to get left behind? Are they involved in any of this? And that's a question to all of you, really.
I'll come in really quickly on the, I know that Cameron and I have had some discussions actually at length about localization and decolonization of aid. So I think there's some really interesting points to reflect on for this panel for sure. But I wanted to come in really quickly about bureaucracies only because it was tailing onto a previous discussion I'd had around how do governments do the same? The challenge that governments are facing right now is similar to what the challenge the humanitarian aid industry is facing, and whether or not our bureaucracies are fit for purpose in this sort of new world. And I think one of the solutions that has been kicked up quite recently within the British government is talking about how we bring in deep technological experts and embed them within policy teams. So you're having them work hand in glove. I know that there are some people at Microsoft, some senior executives at Microsoft who talk about being bilingual. Certainly there's other people who talk about being bilingual in computer science and policy. I think that would be brilliant. I don't think everyone's going to be able to be bilingual, frankly. So I think we're going to have to find new and creative ways to create bureaucratic structures that allow for that cross collaboration, having people who are deep tech specialists sitting within a protection team, sitting within, you know, a water and sanitation team is taking a part way. On the local actors and localization, I'm not very optimistic, I must say. I think there's some interesting analysis coming out about how the development of small and medium-sized enterprises in the global south related to AI and machine learning are you know, it's happening. It's just 5 years behind the curve, and I think the ability to compete in the global market may be limited. I don't know if Cameron will have specific views on that, but I think the evidence didn't look quite so optimistic. But then equally, I think there is a threat of displacing local knowledge and the local voice from the process. And we've spent decades, as you all know, on participation and participatory methods. And there is a risk that humans, with this sort of like cognitive miser effect that we all have of just saying, well, the computer has said this thing. So instead of listening to my colleagues in Goma, who will say that over the last 10 years, we know for a fact that X organization comes in and, you know, has a military push in on this general time of year, right? Because all of these things end up being cyclical. Instead, we'll just ask the computer. And so therefore the sort of voice of from people who are at the front lines is even further silenced. But I don't know, Cameron, if you want to reflect on further on some of those conversations we've had previously.
I mean, not much more to add. I mean, I agree. And this actually goes back to the psychohistory comment that I was making. And as a former field worker, I've had a number of conversations with organizations who are looking to apply technology to areas where I've basically just said, have you just asked your local field teams? I mean, have you just gone down or you're implementing partners, your local implementing partners, and just figured out what they said and acted on that? Because you're going to have a better result instead of, but I mean, Sarah mentioned some people, it's unfortunately sexy where they want people to go, well, the computer said this and this is what we're going to do. And the computer is going to be wrong at some point. And the challenge is you don't know when. So you've got to build that in, and you can't take humans out of the loop like that, especially around human issues. And I mean, I have the conversations with the managers of the Microsoft. We are talking about humanitarian challenges. Humanitarian challenges are challenges caused by other humans, okay, on to humans. So as long as that complexity exists, the idea of an easy technological fix to address those challenges is not going to be there. So it's staying aware and cognizant of that.
Yeah, that sounds like a very important point that we need to remember.
If I may, Wendy, just on on just these 2 points. I mean, I can tell that Sarah and Cameron have spent some time in the humanitarian sector because they know when they're talking about silos. And it's exactly that. When Cameron said, like, well, if you're going to have an AI project, first bring the policy people around the table. Yeah, that's not exactly how it happens. I'm called like a year and a half after the project started, and they're just like, oh, can you make a policy framework that fits that? So it's a little bit the other way around. But that's what I meant by literacy. We don't understand that it is going through everything we do now. It is not a vertical silos and a specificity. It is actually part of our modus operandi. We need to understand that. And we are not there yet. So that's the first one on bureaucracy and what I mean by literacy and how it will hopefully enable better cooperation. And then on localization, I think, well, I mean, I kind of agree with Sarah for now. First of all, let's all do some self-introspection. The humanitarian sector as a whole has a problem with localization. That's why it's been on the agenda since forever, and we're still struggling with it. So already we're not strong. And what I think is, look, AI as it is right now, it's not particularly conducive to localization or local participation. Right, but it's mostly imported from great powers. You know, that's where it comes from. It's imported from multinational companies that are not necessarily anchored in local realities. So it is adding yet another layer again of Western influence perception and also of, like, you know, the circular aid, basically. Who's going to get the money that was invested by donors? Are they AI companies from the same countries? And these kind of things. So it's not really helping the local dimension. To be honest, also, like, I mean, we could see if, you know, we can find inclusion and localization opportunities through AI. I've read the other day something about a drone that was using AI and everything to map something in Uganda. It was done for $30 based on OpenAI. Okay, maybe there is an opportunity there. I don't know yet enough about those things, but I think we should look into it, because also yeah, AI is just going to come and heighten the risk of, there's plenty of conversation around there around digital neocolonialism, around extractivism of it's not natural resources anymore, although that too, but it is data. And it is for the purpose and for the benefits of people who are not there in the local system. So we need to think about that, and the conversation is just starting.
Yes, no, that's interesting. I mean, I'd like to hear more, Pierre, from you about ICRC's thinking on how IA is likely to change warfare, from lethal autonomous weapons systems to misinformation operations. Where do you think the humanitarian industry should be focusing our efforts to meet those new dynamics?
Yeah, so obviously a lot of thinking and efforts being put at the ICRC on trying to imagine, understand, and anticipate the future of warfare. So we are fighting hard on legal and autonomous weapon systems because they are scary. And our point is to always advocate for a human in the loop. Cameron was talking about the importance of that. I think it is absolutely fundamental. Now, what does it mean in the loop? Is it on the loop, in the loop, off the loop, next to the loop? I don't know. And there are plenty of technical dimensions there, but that is basically our main message. We have to keep that human element, otherwise we're just going to lose control. It's clear. So, and we don't want that, basically. We still have to maintain some basic humanitarian rules around this. I think there's also some interesting reflections that we're doing now in relation of what would war look like in the cybersphere or in the digital space. And then the question is, what does a neutral, impartial, independent space or action look like in that space? So for instance, one of the things that we are working on is a digital emblem. You know how the ICRC and Red Cross societies have a Red Cross as the protective emblem for them? So we're thinking of just like, okay, what does it look like in the cyberspace? How do we make an emblem that is digital, recognizable, and protective for humanitarian actors? So plenty of projects around those things. I wouldn't do justice to all of them in this little time that we have available, but you're right. It's definitely something that we need to continue invest and thinking about because it's coming fast.
Yeah, no, really interesting. And Cameron, I think you're also doing some work with the Carter Center, aren't you, around AI in support of peace building? I wonder if you could say a few words about that. You mentioned Carter Center earlier, but maybe you can give us a bit more detail on what you're doing with them.
There's two projects we have at the Carter Center. The first one that I mentioned was, again, it goes back to being a boring one. They have a data stream coming in of articles that of the Syrian conflict, and they needed to extract key details out of the articles to then do their situational analysis. So the articles would come in, say there was an artillery exchange between these two forces at this time, this location. Well, the model now extracts the incident, maps it, and then so now the analysis folks are now just can look at a map and see and run a timeline on what's taking place and start using that going forward. So again, a good example there. There's another one we're also doing around disinformation related to elections. That's going on that we're working with them on. But yeah, again, Carter Center has been quite advanced in this, and they're very good at knowing what they're asking for and why, which is what we're really asking for organizations. And actually, going back to Sarah's point earlier, for those on the call, we are starting to see successes with organizations who are taking a step back, not talking about AI yet, and saying, hey, we need to aggregate and standardize our own internal data first. We've worked with CARE on a project on that. That's been great. And then you think about the analysis, and then where we want to push them, which is on the data sharing component. And then, like, for example, I'll answer one of the questions in the chat from Lily around data protection. I'm not aware of all the open source tools. I can only speak from where Microsoft's at, but a good example there is differential privacy. What is that is, let's say you have a large data set, a good example, patient information. You want to share it because if you can aggregate patient information, you get better analysis the more data you get. But you don't want to share all the sensitive information. So we have tools that introduce white noise, which means that you could receive a data set, but you can't trust any individual row. The aggregate, you can trust. You can look at there's a certain percentage of people have had this illness. But if you try to look at an individual data point, you can't trust it because too much noise has been introduced. And so there are tools like that that are coming on board to help with some of the sensitivity issues, at the same time allowing for that data aggregation to take place.
Wendy, can I jump in really quickly on the back
Yeah,
of that?
do.
Because I feel like what we've done collectively as a panel, I think highlighted a lot of the sort of strategic level risks as well as the sort of operational level ones. And Cameron helpfully has also helped us remind us that there actually is great opportunity and operational efficiencies to be gained. I just wanted to say really quickly about some of the things in addition to the Yemen cholera one that I found. There's a couple of different use cases that I don't think are necessarily being explored to their greatest impact. And I'm not sure what lessons this has for the sort of peace building audience that might be dialing now, but Cameron was talking about casework and the impact or the use of some of these tools in case management services. And my background is in child protection and GBV. And, you know, obviously incredibly sensitive data, either from a sort of domestic social work perspective, as well as sort of social work in a conflict setting. But there are interesting tools that are being used in domestic but low resource environments to establish risk ratings for children or for clients that are more or that face higher risks on the basis of historic data that have higher risk of abuse, recruitment, displacement, et cetera, higher risks of future violations, which could help an agency or a caseworker. Oftentimes, I mean, this would go if, you know, for South London and Croydon, or as much as it would be in sort of Juba. Caseworkers are notoriously overworked, stretched, under-resourced, and trying to have yet an additional tool, not the only tool, but an additional tool to help identify which cases might need additional resources because they are higher risk, and therefore allocate more caseworker time or more caseworkers period to a case to follow them to make sure that they're receiving enough attention. That is a use case that's being used right now in low and middle income countries, low resource settings, but not necessarily in humanitarian ones, that I think deserves a bit of thinking. The other one relates back to our conversation about localization and participatory methods. Now, a lot of these tools do offer us the chance to communicate with a huge number of people in much different ways, rather than being on the back of the boda and like going out to, you know, having to take a 5-day field trip to go and speak to 20 people and come back. So I just don't think we're thinking creatively enough about how to reach people. I think there is oftentimes this sort of not very well thought through conclusion, like, well, no one has a phone, so therefore we shouldn't be using this, or that like the phones are only being held by men, so therefore we shouldn't be using these tools. I think we just need to make sure we're not doing, you know, we're not making the sort of perfect at the exclusion of the good. I can't remember what that is. It's like, or the good enough, right? So, or just seeing the ways to which leverage these new technologies as an additional, but not the only solution. So there's ways to use these to improve participation. And in fact, I would argue to get people to actually contribute their views as to what humanitarian actors should be doing to respond, rather than just being like, well, here are these guys who've rocked up with some plastic sheeting and sorghum and oil. We didn't say that was particularly what we wanted, but we might as well take it. You could actually be doing community consultations in a far more effective, efficient way as one source of information. But again, we haven't necessarily gotten there. I mean, there are some big agencies who are starting to think about that, but not necessarily from a sort of participatory angle. It's more about trying to increase expense.
And what about local service providers or local tech companies and innovators? Are we making adequate use of those people, connecting with them, involving them?
So Cameron might have views. The bits that I was able to uncover, I would say not really. And I think that speaks to a wider issue about how much humanitarian organizations procure from local providers anyway, whether it's tech services or whether it's plastic buckets. I think the procurement and supply chains are skewed towards the global north. And I think that's probably one of the critical pieces related to localization, is to try and look at how you shift power, i.e. that purchasing power, back to smaller and medium-sized enterprises in the global south, including tech firms.
Thanks. Pierre, did you want to say anything on those points? And I've also got one or two things from the chat I need to mention. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to also add some about the opportunities that were mentioned, because indeed I see we're not only, you know, scared and just like stuck on these things, that we do see the opportunities and we do want to get there, because we really have, it's a moral imperative. We have no choice. Like, that's something we need to do. So where we do see, at least at the HCLC, from the few services and projects that I know, so definitely, and this is where I'm expecting more AI. It's to kill the bureaucracy. Please bring us AI that can help us reduce the amount of work we spend in reporting, in putting things together, blah, blah, blah. This is where we need to invest. And I think the cost effectiveness will come there. Let's not pretend that it will come affected population. It will come for. Hopefully we can, use the time and the money and energy we save there into doing the right thing, and not into further feeding the bureaucracy. So please, more AI for bureaucracy, that would be helpful. I think for us, definitely drone and remote sensing for humanitarian mapping, the different style of humanitarian mapping, definitely there's plenty that we are already doing, but there's probably more coming up. Computer vision, we have, at the HCLC, we have a long history, 160 years. So we have a problem with archives. We need to digitalize them, all of them. AI can be tremendously helpful in that. And so these are the things where, look, bring it on, because it does make a difference, and we need more of that. So let's spend, as Sarah was saying, let's spend less time to find potential use. What is it that we can do with AI? No, the question is, what is it we want to do? And then is AI useful for that purpose? And I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves now.
Yeah, Cameron, that's a really good point. Cameron, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to jump on that. We deal a lot with innovation teams from organizations, and just to that, they're like, I want to take all this magical technology and I am going to revolutionize all my program work. And we've actually seen, and I'm blanking on which organization it was. There was actually a nonprofit, a US nonprofit. They built an innovation team, separate, completely removed it from the organization, and they were focused pretty much only on internal operations. How can the technology revolutionize all of their internal work so that they can deliver better programs? And they did a massive investment, and the impact was huge. And that's the way they approached it. And that's what we would love conversations. We'd also love to have with innovation teams. Like, hey, I know it's boring, but can we bring in your HR department? Can we bring in your procurement team? Let's talk about solutions that companies like us have actually already deployed in the private sector. Like, these are solutions that already exist, which also make them a little bit more acceptable, a little bit easier to grab a hold of. But also to Sarah's point, because I want to jump on it as a former program officer, please bring your field folk as well, not only the policy folks, but your operational folks to these conversations, because it is frustrating for everybody to talk about a technology or a solution, but it actually not make a difference on the ground because it doesn't actually meet their needs. So it's one thing that not only Microsoft, but other tech companies and account teams, let them talk to the program people, let them talk to the HR and procurement and operations people. If you could please take that back, it'd be great.
Great.
I just wanted to say one really quick point, Wendy. I know we're pressed for time, but just on that, what I found really interesting about predictive analytics, I think in some ways, AI and machine learning is being used as a sort of placeholder for predicting the movement of populations, and like everyone's got this tunnel vision to just only look at that. And Pierre and Cameron have done a really good job of like flagging why that might not be the best or the only thing we should be looking at. What I was surprised by in my initial research was that in trying to identify where the potential movement of populations related to sort of humanitarian crises is that it wasn't necessarily being linked to supply chains. Because I would have thought, well, now you can pre-position things, because if we look at our global data, it means that we've got likelihood of, 50% of our response will be in this sub-national region. Well, let's try and pre-position things that we remove the response, we reduce the response time. And in fact, what it's being linked to, and I think this is a bit that needs to be unpicked a little bit, it's being linked to unlocking finances and financing resourcing that's held up in bureaucracies. So either internal UN bureaucracies and trying to release that and trying to help grease the wheels of those UN bureaucracies. But I would argue, and I suppose in my capacity as a former British civil servant, is that I'm not sure that that evidence and better data is going to be the trigger for policy decisions about resourcing. I don't think that's the motivator for big public institutions like the former DFID and USAID. They have a lot of data. They have a lot of information about what's happening on the ground. There are other obstacles to releasing that funding. So the investments that we're making in predictive analytics for population displacement should be looking back at trying to improve our own internal operations and our own internal bureaucracies, rather than trying to convince heads of state and heads, ministers, UK ministers, to do a better, to do the morally right thing or to unlock future funding.
Thanks, Sarah. No, I mean, a fascinating discussion. I have so many questions remaining. I failed to ask everyone if anyone could share a pointer about the work about satellite-based damage assessment from Ingmar. So if anybody wants to reply or Cameron, do you have a good pointer there?
Basically just saying, like, look, it works, Ingmar, the models we've helped develop, I mean, they're not beautiful, but it's enough the goal is to find areas of focus for response organizations as fast as possible. It's not meant to be an engineering assessment. It's not meant to guide reconstruction efforts. It's meant like, hey, a hurricane has hit. Where are my most damaged areas? I need to know now so I can get things moving. And we're having some success there. And like I said, that's with the Netherlands 510, Red Cross Unit 510. And that's actually linked now also to Humanitarian OpenStreetMap. So we have another program to push that data to HOT, so the volunteer mappers can also validate the model's output, but then also post to OpenStreetMap for other humanitarian workers to use. So that's a good example of where this technology is appropriate and can have an impact, but and again, the human supervision on there.
Thanks very much. I can't believe that we're out of time already, because I feel as if we could go on for another hour easily. Really fascinating discussion. I just want to thank everybody who joined us today, and to thank all of you, because it's been really interesting. I urge you to read Sarah's paper. You can again find it on the Humanitarian Practice Network website. The link is in the chat. And I know that this conversation is going to continue in many different fora for a long time to come. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a good day or a good evening wherever you are.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.